I think we're all settled in. So a good amount of our shots in Dark Phoenix looks like the image you see here. Our scope of work was quite broad. There's a lot of green screen work to do, 2D cleanup, integration, of course modeling, and last but not least is dynamics. We did all our dynamics using Houdini. And there's parts of the job that's very labor intensive using Nuke. And sometimes you just can't help it but put in the time to make sure that those kind of things work out. But when it comes to dynamics, I find that there's always a way to optimize everything. And today, I'll be showing you some of the work we did on Dark Phoenix and how we created visually appealing effects with a minimalist setup. And my name is George. I've been in visual effects for a long time now, about 12 and a half years at Soho, but I've been in the industry since 2002. And the most recent projects I supervised are The Mist, Tomb Raider, and we just finished Game of Thrones. As far as Dark Phoenix goes, I didn't supervise that one, but I did some of the FX work on that as well. Now, a little tidbit about Soho. Soho's been around the industry for 17 years now. We generally do about 200 to 400 shots on a regular project, but if we enter a project a little bit late or it's a smaller scope of work, then we'll only do about 50 to 100. We are growing and we're continuing to grow, and we're actually moving to a new facility by August. At this point, we've finished about 115 projects, maybe 117 by the time I get back home. And we just have a little over 100 artists. The current projects we have are It Chapter 2, Bad Boys for Life, Ad Astra, and a Disney movie called Togo. So about 4 years ago, we realized that our FX department needed a little bit of updating. So what we did was we migrated the entire FX department into using Houdini. So if any of you are kind of learning Houdini, you can probably imagine that it was a lot of fun for our FX department to learn Houdini while working on Age of Ultron. But since then, we've kind of been outdoing ourselves on every single project that we've been doing. And some of the best dynamics work that Soho has done is actually seen in Dark Phoenix. And some info about Dark Phoenix. We did about 220 shots in this show, and we had it for a little over 2 years, which is kind of long for us. And that's mostly because they had that bit of delay of releasing the movie. Usually we'll have a show for about 6 months to a year. And the sequence that we were mostly involved in, as far as dynamics goes, was the shuttle rescue sequence, close to the beginning of the movie, if anyone here has watched it. And the supervisor we had for this particular show was Keith Sellers. He did an excellent job kind of getting the shots done in time and making sure that they look good, and also making sure that the artists don't hate each other by the end of the project. Now, the kind of FX work we did for this show was including shuttle debris, gas leaks all over the shuttle. We also formed some ice crystals on the exterior of the shuttle. We did Cyclops I-beam, the X-jet thrusters, and we also generated some procedurally generated trees, Jean Grey's hair, of course, the Nightcrawler's Bamf, and a very mysterious looking entity. Now, our scope of work kind of starts in this sequence here. So over here, you kind of see this X-jet rising, and they're basically sent out to a rescue mission to save the astronauts in space. And right now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because this giant ship is rising, but the trees aren't moving at all. So what we did was we created some procedurally generated trees using Houdini. And the setup for that was pretty simple. You kind of start with a curve, you extrude a tube out of it, you add some attributes, you do some for loops, and then you start adding branches by doing that. So once you have some branches, you kind of repeat the same process again. Now you have even more branches. Let me just go back to that. All right, yeah, now you have even more branches, and it starts looking like a tree. So then you repeat this process one more time, and now you add even more branches and even more leaves, And I know that the setup looks kind of complicated on the right side of the screen because of all the for loops and all the attributes we added, but the idea is kind of simple. You're kind of just reiterating the same setup. And since we've also created this entire tree procedurally, we can now make hundreds of these if we wanted to. I think in this case, we only use about 8. The other thing we did with this procedurally generated tree was we drove the animation using 3D noises. So on the left side, you can see this ball rising. It's a very, very early test that we did, and you can see it affecting the motion of the tree. As it gets further away, it would affect it less. And you can also see on the right side some early tests that we did. So on the right side, you can kind of see that the trees are a little bit jittery at the beginning, but by the time we got to version 32 of this, it started looking better, which is what you see on the bottom right. So this is what it looks like in the sequence, just a few shots. So the X-Jet is starting to rise from the ground as this hatch opens up, and then it continues to rise. It affects the leaves a little bit more, and then they'll kind of turbulate quite a bit. And then by the time the X-Jet is up in the air, then the leaves are moving less and less. So once the X-Men are up in the air, then we kind of need to thrust them out of the Earth's atmosphere. And what we did was we generated some thrusters. In this case, we used the actual shuttle launches to use as reference for the amount of smoke coming out. And what you can see here is that as the X-Jet gets more into the outer space, there's less and less atmosphere, so that smoke gets thinner until they turn off the thrusters, and they kind of just coast into orbit. So how do we do the thrusters? Well, first thing is you needed a jet. So we got the geometry. We create particles. We turbulate the particles with noise. We add a velocity field, and then we use Houdini's smoke solver to add pretty much the smoke. So now at Soho, what we do is we try to animate things as realistically as possible. So when this jet was animated going upwards vertically, it was actually moving really, really fast. So if anyone here has some experience simulating smoke, you can probably imagine that that causes a bit of stepping and a bit of trouble. So what we did was we actually, well, you can see it on this test on the top left, version 3, you can see a bit of that stepping happening, right? So what we did was we emitted even more particles coming out of the thrusters, and then we used a process in Houdini called volume rasterized particles to convert the particles into a volume. And then we put those two volumes together, the smoke simulation and the particles, and have some hot lighting happening in there to kind of hide that problem that we had. And you can see that in version 10 where we kind of fix all that problem, and we also add a bit of camera shake. And then the last thing we did was we animated the density of the smoke, because as you emit less and less smoke, then it gets a bit thinner, but the clients wanted the smoke to look thick throughout the entire shot. So that's what you see on the bottom right. Anyway, as the X-Men enters space, we kind of cut into these shots where you see a lot of smoke and debris floating around inside the shuttle. And how do we do that? Well, if the problem you usually get with smoke, especially when you're doing high dense smoke, is that it's extremely slow to simulate these type of things. So what we did to help this is to cut up the shuttle, the interior of the shuttle, into small sections. In this case, we cut it up into 10 little sections so that we can sim it a bit faster. By doing this, I was able to simulate 10 little quadrants of the shuttle at a time, send it to our farm, and within about 2 hours' time, we would actually see results. And by doing this, we were able to get a lot of iterations throughout one day. And the final render for this particular shot took about 5 hours to render. Another thing we did was we had Quicksilver swimming through a lot of debris. In this case, there's about 10,000 tiny, tiny little pieces that's floating around, and about 3,000 large and medium-sized pieces. This sim only took about an hour to get done, And it's mostly because we used bullet RBD, because that's all we needed. Since we used Houdini to do this, we had full control over every single piece that was there, because in this case, sometimes we needed to slow down the spin of a piece of particle. Maybe the client just didn't want a specific piece going in front of his face, so we deleted it. Or some of them, we kind of just needed to slow it down quite a bit. Since every single piece had a unique identifier, it was very easy to adjust all that. Now, this entire rescue mission kind of happens fairly quickly. Okay, the entire mission actually happens within seconds. And what happens here is Nightcrawler bamfs into the shuttle, Quicksilver collects all the astronauts, and then they bamf out of the shuttle and back into safety. So what does this mean for us? It means that we got to do some R&D on a very unique effect. And I know that some of you have probably seen the Nightcrawler effect before. It's nothing new, but in this case, it was a little bit new for us because the Bamf is now in zero gravity and in extreme slow-mo bullet time. So it's fun to do a bit of R&D on that. But what I found that was very interesting when I was kind of putting this presentation together was that this is all it took to set up our Bamf. It was nothing convoluted. It was actually a fairly simple setup. The screen you see on the left is our smoke dynamics network. So this is what kind of generated the initial motion of the smoke. And then what we do is we take that same smoke motion and we use that to advect a couple million particles. So that's basically what makes up the look of it. And then we have some fields in there to kind of slow down the particles as well. And the ingredients of the Bamf effect is pretty much made out of some mesh, an animated mesh, of course. We convert that into VDB to turn it into a collision object. We remesh it so that we get rid of all the intersecting geometry. And then, of course, we need a lot of points. So in this particular case, we had, the regular Bamf effect had about 100 million points. And then we also use some velocities, some custom velocities, which is what you see on the left side. And that's what we use in order to get this initial puff of the motion of the particles. And what you see on the right side is pretty much what happens to it when you have this initial puff, and then you animate down the velocity so that it slows down. Now, the next step after this is actually turning this into the Bamf effect. Now, our FX TD Alisgar came up with this method. Well, he didn't come up with it, but he's been using it for about 2 years. And so what he realized is that if you take a lot of particles and convert that into a volume and use its own velocity to drive the motion of the blur on the particles, is that it starts looking like smoke, which is kind of pretty much where this came from. And this is what 100 million particles rasterized into a volume looks like. We did 2 passes. On the left side is pretty much inheriting the person's color, whoever it is. It might be an astronaut, another X-Men, and in this case, it's actually Nightcrawler. And then we had a larger puff of smoke on the right side, which is this just blue kind of explosion of smoke. Now, the real trouble kind of happened when we were doing the Bamf in bullet time. Here's what the render looks like. Now, the trouble with it was that, you see it a lot more because now it's in slow motion and we're very close to it. So we need to do something a bit different. At first, we tried recycling this same setup, but it kind of just gave us problems with stepping and kind of rendering issues as well. So what we ended up doing was we actually tripled the amount of particles being rendered into 300 million particles. So that's what it kind of looks like. And if you look really, really closely, maybe you'll pick out a few particles here and there. But yeah, 300 million particles in extreme slow motion looks like that. Now back to the storyline. What happens is after Nightcrawler and Quicksilver makes this rescue, they realize that they left one more astronaut behind. So they had to make another rescue attempt, this time with Jean Grey tagging along with Nightcrawler to rescue the last astronaut. But what happens is he was unable to save her, and she kind of got left in there where this entity kind of takes over and takes her along for the ride. So that's pretty much what kind of prompted the movie from turning her into the Phoenix. So then what is this entity anyway? So this entity kind of started out as a solar flare. And what we did, because we like to do things with realistic scale, is we kind of had a bunch of particles almost from the distance of the sun hitting the shuttle. But luckily, they did change the idea into this more of a purpley-looking, galaxy-looking thing. And when the idea changed, the description of the new entity was described as a clear liquid with internal glow and a thin layer of smoke. So that's what you saw, what you will see very soon. Not that one. This one. Okay. But before I move forward, there's this probably odd-looking thing that you saw earlier. So this is one of my favorite assets. We've now used it in 3 different projects. We use this on The Mist, Game of Thrones, and we've also used it on Dark Phoenix. So what this is pretty much the simplest thing you can make. It's just a tube with a curve in the middle, and it's been rigged for animation. And what we did with this was we used it to pose the general size and shape and motion of the actual entity. And we were able to use that to block out what the entity was doing, get client approval, and then move on with doing dynamics. So by doing this, it takes away a lot of the guesswork of simulating and wasting time doing that over and over. We did 2 types of entities. One is the exterior, which is what you just saw, and another one that is the interior. So the interior one, what you see on the left side are a bunch of different particle simulations we did. And this entity is also 300 million particles. That's our magic number in Soho. We did an internal clustering system and wedging system as well to generate a lot of different variations of particles. And what you see on the right side are a mix of meshed out particles because we needed to render something reflective and refractive. And we also converted a bunch of these particles into a volume by using volume rasterized particles. So that's what you're seeing there. This particular shot here took about 60 hours to render, and we used 3 layers of smoke particles and 3 layers of mesh particles. And the main reason why it took so long to render is because the illuminated meshes was actually lighting up the smoke passes. Now, at some point, the entity passes through, and then kind of Jean Grey is left out floating in space. Eventually, Nightcrawler gets to her and rescues her as well and brings her back into safety. Now, in all these Jean Grey shots, she actually she didn't have any hair. She was wearing a cap. So we needed to generate a bunch of CG hair. Now, the funniest story I can tell you about this was that the guy, his name is Steve, but the guy that generated all the smoke all the hair, didn't have any hair. He was the baldest guy in our studio. And, but he did a pretty good job, I think. So the way we did it was that we took the scalp, we emitted a bunch of particles out of the scalp, and then we tied all the particles together into a curve and smoothed it out, and that's pretty much what generates the hair. So that's what it looks like. And then we use Houdini's wire solver to add a bit of flow, because when we were working on this, we realized that when we actually did some research on what hair looks like in space, it was actually not very interesting. It was kind of just dull and just sat there. So we needed to add a bit of motion to make it a bit more interesting. So after that happens, we kind of use Houdini's guide process and hair clump tools to multiply the amount of hair on her head. So that's what it looks like. And then the end product looks like this. So that's Steve's hair. I mean, not Steve's hair, but the hair that he made. It looks pretty good despite the lack of hair on his head. So I found this quote online. I'd like to read it to you. I heard it was from someone famous. So when you first start off trying to solve a problem, the first solutions you come up with are very complex. And most people stop there. But if you keep going and live with the problem and peel more layers of the onion off, you can oftentimes arrive at some very elegant and simple solutions. So that's a quote from Steve Jobs. I heard he was famous. Anyway, I thought that was applicable to this. And in this project, we spent a lot of time perfecting our shots. But the underlying mechanism of all these shots I showed you today, the idea was kind of simple. So for the trees, I just scattered a bunch of points there, and we used a bunch of curves to generate all the branches. The I-beam, thrusters, Bamf, and entity are all rasterized particles. And Gene's hair was created from pretty much a particle simulation. Now, don't get me wrong, this project was not a walk in the park, but avoiding convoluted setups and using simplified workflows really helped us out. It helped out our FX team push out iterations quickly and efficiently. Those guys are truly the best at what they do. But before, that pretty much sums up what I'm going to talk about. But before I leave, I'd like to show you our newest reel. So hopefully this sounds. That's all I got. Thanks. So if anyone has questions, I'll answer questions until they yank me out of the stage. Huh? Anyone ask questions? Yeah, sure.
Can you explain your tentacle rig a little more? Like, what was that actually driving?
Yeah, so what we...
The tentacle rig you showed a little bit more.
Yep. So we've used it on a bunch of projects, and all it is it's a rigged up, imagine a tentacle from an octopus. It's a rigged up thing, and we pose it, and then once we have it posed and it's animated, what we do is we take that same mesh and we take the velocities from that and the volume that it's taking, depending on really what we're doing, and we convert that into a volume or some sort of emitter in Houdini.
Okay, so it's just for emission.
Yeah, it could be used for pretty much anything, really. It's just basically a fluid source, depending on what you're doing. But yeah, it's just for us, it's been specifically super useful for the kind of work that we've been doing lately. Yeah.